The alarm screamed through every corridor of the celestial dawn. Red lights flashed in angry pulses, painting the metal walls in waves of crimson. Deho ran through the lower deck, his boots clanging against the metal floor. Explosions rocked the massive warship, throwing him against the wall. He caught himself and kept running. The ship was dying. Everyone knew it. The Vorthi attack had come from nowhere, appearing out of the nebula like ghosts made real. Their weapons cut through the Coalition's defensive line like it was nothing. Now the Celestial Dawn, pride of the Galactic Union fleet, was burning from the inside out. Deho reached the engineering bay and dove through the door just as another explosion shook the ship. His station was chaos. Screens showed critical failures across every system. The main reactor was offline. Life support was failing in 3 sections. Half the crew was already dead. He worked fast, his hands moving across the controls. He rerouted power from the damaged sections, trying to keep the remaining systems alive long enough for everyone to evacuate. His headset crackled with panicked voices. Species he had never heard of screamed in languages he didn't understand. But he understood fear. Fear sounded the same in every language. All hands, abandon ship. Repeat, abandon ship. The captain's voice cut through the chaos. Proceed to evacuation pods immediately. Deho saved his work and turned to leave. That's when he heard it, a grinding metal sound deep and wrong. He looked up just as the blast door began to close. The impact from the last explosion had damaged the controls. The door was shutting and it was moving fast. He ran. His lungs burned as he pushed his body as hard as it would go. The door was already halfway closed. He could make it. He had to make it. 10 meters, 5 meters, 3 meters. The door slammed shut in his face with a boom that echoed through the empty bay. Deho pounded on the metal with his fists. "No, open up. I'm still in here." He ran to the control panel beside the door. His fingers flew across the interface, entering emergency override codes. Nothing worked. The system was completely dead. The blast had fried the circuits. He activated his communicator. "This is Lieutenant Kim in lower engineering. The blast door is stuck. I'm trapped. I need emergency extraction." His voice was steady despite the fear crawling up his spine. Static answered him, then a voice cold and reptilian. "Commander Velness, the ship's executive officer. Lieutenant Kim, what is your situation?" "I'm sealed in the lower engineering bay. The door controls are dead. I need a team to cut through or override from your end." Silence. It stretched too long. Deho felt his stomach drop. "Commander?" he said. "Did you copy?" "I copied, Lieutenant." Velness's voice was flat. "How long would extraction take?" "Maybe 10 minutes if you override the door. 20 if you need to cut through." More silence. Deho could hear other voices in the background. Alien languages arguing. He heard his name. He heard the word human. "Lieutenant Kim," Velness said finally. "The Vorthi fleet will be in boarding range in 8 minutes. We don't have 20 minutes. We don't have 10. Deho's blood went cold. "Commander, I'm asking for 10 minutes. "And I'm telling you we don't have it." Velness's voice hardened. "The evacuation is almost complete. We have 300 souls on this ship that we can save. I won't risk them for one person." "One person?" Deho's voice rose despite himself. "I'm a member of this crew. You can't just leave me here. You're a human, Lieutenant." Another voice now sharper. Captain Theros, a towering insectoid from a species Deho couldn't pronounce. "You've been with this crew for 3 months. The others have served for years. The calculation is simple." "Calculation?" Deho slammed his hand against the wall. "I'm not a number on a spreadsheet. I'm a person. I have a family. We all have families," Captain Theros cut him off. "The decision is made." "I'm sorry, Lieutenant. Your sacrifice will be remembered." "Wait. Captain, please." Deho shouted into the communicator. "Don't do this. I can make it to another evacuation point. Just give me a chance." The line went dead. Deho stood in the silence, his hand still pressing the communicator button. He pressed it again. And again. Nothing but static. They had cut him off. They weren't coming back. He walked slowly to the viewport on the far wall. Through the reinforced glass, he could see the battle outside. Vorthi ships, massive and dark, cut through the wreckage of the Union fleet. Escape pods launched from the celestial dawn like seeds from a dying flower. He watched them streak away into the darkness, carrying everyone who wasn't him. The ship shuddered again. Smaller this time. The Vorthi were getting closer, holding their fire now. They wanted the ship intact. They would board soon, strip it for technology, and kill anyone they found aboard. Deho pressed his forehead against the cold glass. He thought about his family back on Earth, his mother who had cried when he left for the stars, his younger sister who thought he was the bravest person alive. What would they think when they heard he died alone, abandoned by the people he had sworn to serve? Anger began to burn through the fear. Hot and bright, it spread through his chest like fire. They had left him here. These aliens who looked down on humans as primitives, who gave them the worst jobs and the least respect, had decided his life wasn't worth 10 minutes of their time. He pushed away from the viewport and looked around the engineering bay. It was a mess, but it was still functional. Power still flowed through some of the conduits. The screen still showed system statuses. The ship was dying, yes, but it wasn't dead yet. Neither was he. Deho walked back to his station and pulled up the ship's schematics. If they were going to leave him here to die, fine. But he wasn't going to die quietly. He wasn't going to die like some animal waiting for the predator to strike. He was human. His species had crawled out of caves and conquered a planet that tried to kill them every single day. They had split the atom, walked on their moon, and reached for the stars with nothing but determination and ingenuity. Every human carried that legacy in their blood. The Vorthi were coming. They thought they were boarding a dead ship. They thought wrong. Deho's fingers began to move across the controls, pulling up weapon systems, power grids, and defensive protocols. His fear was still there, cold in his belly, but the anger burned hotter. They wanted to leave him behind? They wanted to throw away his life like it meant nothing? He would show them what one human could do when pushed to the edge. He would show them all. The emergency lights cast long shadows across the engineering bay. Deho sat at his station, forcing himself to breathe slowly. Panic would kill him faster than the Vorthi. He needed to think. He needed a plan. First, he had to know what he was working with. He pulled up the ship's system status on the main screen. The damage report made his heart sink. Main reactor offline. Primary weapons offline. Navigation offline. Life support at 30% and dropping. The Celestial Dawn was a corpse in space, held together by emergency power and luck. But corpses could still have teeth. Deho expanded the auxiliary power grid. There, 6 backup generators were still running, feeding power to secondary systems throughout the ship. It wasn't much, but it was something. He traced the power lines with his finger on the screen, following them through the ship's architecture. The point defense systems were still connected. The railgun batteries on the port side still had power feeds, even if they were disconnected from the bridge controls. The internal security systems were damaged but functional. It wasn't an arsenal, but it was more than nothing. A proximity alarm beeped softly. Deho switched screens and felt ice in his veins. 3 Vorthi ships were approaching, big ones. The lead vessel was already extending a docking tube toward the Celestial Dawn's main airlock. They would be inside the ship within the hour. He had to move. Sitting in the engineering bay was a death sentence. He grabbed a repair kit from the wall locker and stuffed it into his pack. He added emergency rations, water packs, and a small medical kit. His hand hovered over the locker's weapon rack. The plasma pistol would be useless against Vorthi armor, but he took it anyway. It made him feel slightly less helpless. Deho sealed the bay behind him and moved into the corridor. The ship creaked and groaned around him like a living thing in pain. Sparks fell from damaged ceiling panels. Smoke drifted through the air, illuminated by the red emergency lights. He moved quickly but carefully, his eyes scanning for danger. The armory was 3 decks up. Getting there meant passing through sections that might be damaged or exposed to vacuum. Deho checked his suit seals and started climbing. The elevator was dead, so he used the maintenance ladders. His arms burned by the time he reached the 3rd level, but he didn't stop. The armory door was sealed but not locked. The crew had been too rushed to secure it properly. Deho pushed it open and stepped inside. Weapons lined the walls. Rifles, grenades, combat armor, all of it designed for alien physiology. The rifles were too big for his hands. The armor wouldn't fit his frame, but there were things he could use. He found a bandolier of plasma charges and slung it over his shoulder. A cutting torch went into his pack. He grabbed a case of micromines, each one small enough to fit in his palm but powerful enough to breach a bulkhead. Finally, he found what he was really looking for: the weapons control terminal. Every warship had a backup control system for the weapons, separate from the bridge. It was a fail-safe in case the bridge was destroyed. The terminal in the armory was one of 3 such stations on the ship. Deho powered it on and held his breath. The screen flickered to life. Access to the weapons grid appeared before him. He laughed, the sound strange and harsh in the empty room. They had left the system unlocked in their rush to evacuate. He could see every weapon on the ship, from the massive railguns to the smallest point defense turrets. Most showed red, offline, damaged, or unpowered. But some showed yellow, standby mode, waiting for power and targeting data. Deho's mind raced. He could work with this. A skittering sound echoed from somewhere above. Deho froze, his hand moving to the plasma pistol. He knew that sound. 4th scout drones, small spider-like machines that moved through ductwork and vents, mapping the ship and searching for survivors. He couldn't stay here. The drones would find him eventually. But he couldn't leave without completing his work. Deho pulled a data stick from his pocket and plugged it into the terminal. His fingers flew across the controls, downloading the weapons grid access codes and power routing protocols. If he was going to fight, he needed to be able to control the ship's weapons from anywhere. The skittering grew louder, closer. Deho watched the download progress bar creep forward. 70%, 80%. The sound was right above him now in the ceiling vent. 90%. A panel in the ceiling burst open. A drone dropped through, its 6 legs extended, its optical sensors glowing red. It spotted Deho immediately and let out a high-pitched screech, calling for more drones. Deho yanked the data stick free and rolled to the side as the drone lunged. Its legs scraped across the console where he had been standing. He came up running, burst through the armory door, and sprinted down the corridor. Behind him, he heard more screeching. More drones were coming. He ran through the damaged ship, his boots pounding on metal floors. The drones were fast, skittering along walls and ceilings, but Deho knew these corridors. He had walked them every day for 3 months while the alien crew ignored him. Now that knowledge might save his life. He turned a corner and saw his chance. A damaged section ahead, the floor torn open by an explosion. The gap was too wide to jump normally, but Deho didn't slow down. He hit the edge at full speed and leaped. For a moment he was airborne, suspended over darkness. Then his hands caught the far edge and he hauled himself up. The drones screeched in frustration on the other side of the gap. They were too light to jump it. Deho allowed himself one breath of relief, then kept moving. He made his way to a secondary control room buried deep in the ship's core. It was small, designed for damage control teams, but it had what he needed: power routing controls and a connection to the weapons grid. Deho locked the door behind him and collapsed into the chair. His hand shook as he plugged in the data stick. The stolen codes worked perfectly, giving him access to systems he had no business controlling. He pulled up the ship's layout and started planning. The Vorthi would board through the main airlock. They would move through the ship in standard search patterns, sweeping each deck. But they would be careless. They thought the ship was abandoned. They thought there was no threat. Deho began programming automated responses into the ship's systems. Doors that would seal behind the boarding parties, trapping them. Life support cutoffs in specific sections. Emergency venting protocols he could trigger remotely. And most importantly, he traced power lines from the auxiliary generators to the weapon systems. He couldn't power all the weapons. The generators weren't strong enough. But he didn't need all of them. He just needed the right ones at the right time. Hours passed. Deho worked without stopping, fueled by anger and fear and the determination not to die here alone. He set traps throughout the ship, each one carefully calculated. He rerouted power through damaged conduits, bypassing destroyed systems, creating new pathways through the ship's dying nervous system. Finally, he leaned back and looked at his work. It wasn't pretty. It was held together with emergency protocols and jury-rigged code. Any proper engineer would call it a disaster. But it might work. It might actually work. A deep vibration ran through the ship. The docking tube had connected. The Vorthi were here. Deho pulled up the security feeds. He could see them now. Dozens of armored figures moving through the airlock, spreading into the ship like a disease. They carried weapons designed to kill, but they held them casually. They weren't expecting a fight. They should have been. Through the security feeds, Deho watched the Vorthi spread through his ship. There were 40 of them in the first wave. They moved in groups of 4, their armored bodies reflecting the red emergency lights. They were big, each one at least 7 feet tall, with segmented armor that looked organic and technological at the same time. Their leader stood at the airlock, directing teams with sharp gestures. Deho recognized the casual confidence in those movements. They had done this before. Many times. Board the damaged ship, kill any survivors, strip anything valuable, and move on. Simple. Easy. Deho's finger hovered over the first trap. His hand was steady now. The fear was still there, buried deep in his chest, but the anger burned brighter. These creatures were here to loot and kill. The aliens who had abandoned him expected him to die quietly. Everyone expected humans to know their place. He pressed the button. The explosion tore through the docking section like the fist of an angry god. Deho had packed every plasma charge from the armory into the corridor behind the airlock. The blast was beautiful and terrible, a white-hot flower of destruction that consumed everything in its path. The security feed went white, then black. When the image returned, the corridor was gone. In its place was twisted metal and vacuum. Bodies floated in the darkness, torn apart by the explosion and the sudden decompression. The Vorthi docking ship, still attached to the airlock, was ripped open along one side. Atmosphere vented into space in a glittering stream. The remaining Vorthi inside the celestial dawn scattered in panic. Their calm confidence shattered in an instant. Deho could hear their communications now, patched through the ship's systems. They were screaming, not in pain but in shock and confusion. The dead ship was fighting back. "Unknown explosives detected," one of them shouted. "Multiple casualties. Requesting backup." "Negative," came the reply from the fleet. "Handle it. It's probably automatic defenses." Deho smiled without humor. Let them think that. Let them think it was just machines. He pulled up the internal sensors and tracked the Vorthi teams. They had split up, some trying to reach their damaged ship, others pushing deeper into the celestial dawn. The emergency bulkheads had sealed automatically after the explosion, cutting off both groups from each other. Perfect. He selected the team closest to his position. 4 Vorthi, moving carefully now, their weapons raised. They were in a maintenance corridor 2 decks below him. Deho pulled up the environmental controls for that section and studied the options. Life support could be cut off gradually or instantly. Gradually would be quiet but slow. Instantly would be loud but effective. He needed these first kills to send a message. He needed them to be afraid. He cut life support and triggered the emergency venting protocol. The Vorthi in the corridor had maybe 2 seconds of warning. Just enough time to realize something was wrong. Then every vent in that section opened at once and the atmosphere rushed out. The Vorthi were yanked off their feet and slammed against the walls. Their armor protected them from the immediate decompression, but it couldn't help them against what came next. Deho sealed the vents and flooded the corridor with coolant from the damaged reactor system. The temperature dropped to nearly absolute zero in seconds. The Vorthi became statues, frozen in positions of struggle and panic. When Deho opened the vents again, their bodies shattered like glass. He moved to the next team. These ones were smarter. They had found a defensive position in one of the cargo bays and were setting up equipment. Scanning gear by the looks of it. They were trying to locate him. Deho couldn't let them complete that setup. He accessed the cargo bay's systems and found that one of the stored containers held industrial solvents, highly flammable industrial solvents. He triggered the container's emergency release. The Vorthi noticed the leak immediately. They started to retreat, but Deho was faster. He sparked the bay's electrical system, sending arcs of electricity through the pooling chemicals. The cargo bay became an inferno. The Vorthi screamed as they burned, their armor melting around them. 2 teams down, 16 Vorthi dead, 24 to go, but the remaining Vorthi were adapting. They pulled back to a central location, the main corridor on Deck 3. They set up a defensive perimeter covering all approaches. Their communications had changed tone. They weren't panicked anymore. They were angry. Confirmed active hostile on board, their leader reported. Unknown species. Extremely dangerous. Requesting immediate reinforcement. Reinforcement approved, the fleet responded. Hold position. Backup arriving in 10 minutes. Deho couldn't let them fortify. He couldn't let reinforcements arrive. He needed to end this now, while he still had the element of surprise. But a frontal assault was suicide. 24 armed Vorthi warriors would cut him down in seconds. He needed a different approach. Deho pulled up the ship's weapon systems. The internal defenses were mostly destroyed, but the external weapons were another story. He traced power lines from the auxiliary generators to the portside railgun batteries. 3 of them were still functional, still charged with ammunition. They were designed to fire outward at enemy ships, but with some creative programming, he spent precious minutes rerouting the targeting controls. The weapons weren't designed to aim at the ship they were attached to, but Deho didn't need precision. He just needed destruction. He calculated angles and trajectories, using the ship's own structure to aim the weapons where he needed them. The Vorthi position was directly adjacent to the outer hull, right beside Railgun Battery 7. Deho armed the weapon, overrode every safety protocol, and fired. The railgun round punched through the hull like it was paper. The Vorthi had maybe an instant to see the wall explode inward before the round hit them. At that velocity, the projectile didn't just kill them, it erased them. The round passed through their position and out the other side of the ship, leaving a perfectly cylindrical hole 6 feet wide. Everything in its path simply ceased to exist. The celestial dawn shuddered from the impact. Alarms screamed throughout the ship. Deho held his breath, waiting to see if the damaged structure would hold. Metal groaned and shrieked, but the ship stayed together. The Vorthi communications went silent for a long moment. When they resumed, the tone had changed completely. This wasn't anger anymore. It was fear. All teams retreat to the ship immediately. Abort salvage operation. Hostile has control of ship weapons. Repeat, retreat now. But there was no ship to retreat to. Deho had destroyed their docking vessel in the first explosion. The remaining Vorthi were trapped on the Celestial Dawn with him, and they knew it. Deho tracked them through the security feeds. They were running now, trying to find another way off the ship. They split into smaller groups, desperate and afraid. They had come here as hunters. Now they were prey. He hunted them through the corridors of his ship. Each group fell differently. Some he vented into space. Others he trapped behind bulkheads and slowly suffocated. One group he led into the reactor room and bathed in radiation. He was methodical and merciless. By the time the Vorthi reinforcements arrived, there were no survivors left to rescue. Deho watched from his control room as a second Vorthi ship approached. This one was bigger, a proper military vessel rather than a salvage ship. It kept its distance, scanning the celestial dawn carefully. They had heard the screams of their comrades. They knew something terrible waited inside. Good, let them know. Let them fear. But Deho wasn't done. He pulled up the weapons grid again. The 3 railgun batteries were charged and ready. He had power for maybe 6 more shots before the generators gave out. It had to be enough. The Vorthi ship held position 300 meters away. They were being cautious, probably trying to scan the interior of the Celestial Dawn. They wanted to know what they were facing before they committed more troops. Deho didn't give them the chance. He targeted all 3 railguns at the Vorthi ship and fired in sequence. The first round hit their forward shields. The shields held, but barely. The second round hit the same spot and punched through. The third round struck their engine section. The Vorthi ship broke apart in a cascade of explosions, adding more debris to the battle's graveyard. Deho sat back in his chair, breathing hard. His entire body shook with adrenaline and exhaustion. He had done it. Against impossible odds, he had won. 1 human against 50 trained Vorthi warriors and 2 ships. And he had won, but this was just the beginning. The main Vorthi fleet was still out there, and they would want revenge. The Vorthi fleet hung in space around the Celestial Dawn like predators circling wounded prey. Deho counted 15 ships through the sensor feeds, destroyers, cruisers, and 1 massive dreadnought that dwarfed everything else. They had pulled back after he destroyed the second boarding ship, but they hadn't left. They were regrouping, planning, preparing for overwhelming force. Deho knew he should be terrified. He was 1 man on a dying ship facing an entire fleet. But the fear had burned away hours ago, consumed by something harder and colder. He had been abandoned by people he trusted. He had been left to die because they thought he was worthless. Now he would show them exactly what a worthless human could accomplish. He spent the next hours preparing. The auxiliary generators were running at maximum capacity, charging the railgun batteries 1 painful % at a time. It was slow work and he didn't have much time, but he didn't need full power for what he was planning. He just needed enough. The weapon systems were a patchwork of jury-rigged connections and emergency protocols. Any proper military engineer would have a heart attack looking at his work. But it would function. It would fire. That was all that mattered. Deho studied the Vorthi fleet's formation on his screens. They were arranged in a salvage pattern, optimized for stripping the Celestial Dawn of useful technology. Ships clustered close together, their shields oriented toward potential external threats, not toward the dead vessel they surrounded. It was tactically sound for salvage operations. It was suicide for a combat situation. The Vorthi communications chatter told him everything he needed to know. They were still treating this as a salvage operation with a minor complication. Yes, the hostile had killed some troops and destroyed 2 ships. Yes, it had somehow gained control of the weapons. But this was a dead vessel with failing power. They had 15 warships. They would simply overwhelm it with firepower if necessary. They still didn't understand. They still didn't realize what they were facing. Deho's fingers moved across the controls, setting up firing solutions for each railgun battery. He couldn't aim with the precision of a trained weapons officer, but at this range he didn't need precision. The Vorthi ships were so close he could practically hit them by accident. He checked the power levels one last time. 70% charge on the port batteries, 65% on the starboard. Not optimal, but it would have to do. The Vorthi were moving into position for another boarding attempt. If he waited any longer, they would be ready for him. Deho opened a broadcast on all frequencies. His voice would reach every ship in the area, Vorthi and Union alike. He wanted them all to hear this. This is Lieutenant Deho Kim, human of the Celestial Dawn. His voice was calm, almost conversational. I was abandoned here by my commanding officers. Left to die because they decided one human life wasn't worth their time. The Vorthi came to salvage a dead ship and kill one helpless survivor. But I'm not helpless, and the ship isn't dead yet. He paused, letting his words sink in. Somewhere out there, the Union fleet that had abandoned him was listening. Commander Velnus was listening. Captain Theros was listening. Good. I am one man, Deho continued. One human on a crippled vessel. Count your losses, Vorthi. Remember that one human did this to you. He cut the transmission and fired. The first salvo caught the Vorthi completely unprepared. 3 railgun rounds, each traveling at a significant fraction of light speed, crossed the space between the Celestial Dawn and the fleet in a heartbeat. The first struck a destroyer broadside. The round punched through the unshielded hull, through the reactor containment and out the other side. The ship exploded in a ball of white fire. The second round hit a cruiser's engine section. The ship didn't explode. It simply died, all power cutting out instantly as the engines were torn away. It tumbled through space, a dead hulk trailing debris. The third round missed its target by meters, but at that velocity, close was enough. The kinetic energy transfer from the near miss tore apart a frigate's sensor array and forward weapons. Chaos erupted in the Vorthi fleet. Ships scattered in all directions trying to get distance from the Celestial Dawn, but they were too close together, arranged for salvage rather than combat. 2 destroyers collided as they tried to maneuver, their shields sparking against each other. One of them lost maneuvering control and drifted into the debris field from the first destroyed ship. Deho didn't give them time to organize. He rotated the Celestial Dawn using maneuvering thrusters, bringing fresh railgun batteries to bear. The ship groaned in protest, its damaged structure screaming, but it held together. He fired again, more ships died. A cruiser took a round through its bridge. A destroyer lost its entire port side. The dreadnought's shields held against 2 direct hits, but the third punched through and crippled its main weapon. The Vorthi finally began to respond. Return fire lashed out from a dozen ships. Plasma bolts and kinetic rounds slammed into the Celestial Dawn's hull. Deho had angled the ship to put the most damaged sections between him and the majority of their weapons, using the dead parts of his vessel as armor. But some shots got through. The ship shuddered with each impact. Alarms screamed about hull breaches and structural failures. A direct hit to the starboard side destroyed 2 railgun batteries in a cascade of explosions. Power fluctuated wildly as damaged conduits overloaded, but Deho kept firing. He rotated through the remaining weapons, giving each one time to cool between shots. When one battery overheated, he switched to another. When power dropped too low, he rerouted from life support and non-essential systems. He would suffocate eventually without life support, but he would take as many of them with him as possible. The Vorthi dreadnought pushed forward, apparently deciding to end this with overwhelming firepower. Its massive main weapon began to charge, energy building invisible arcs along its barrel. That weapon could crack a planet. It would erase the Celestial Dawn from existence. Deho dumped every remaining bit of auxiliary power into one railgun battery. The weapon whined as it charged beyond safe limits. Warning lights flashed across his console. The barrel temperature was approaching critical. The containment fields were failing. If he fired this shot, the weapon would destroy itself. He fired. The round hit the dreadnought's charging main weapon dead center. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the dreadnought's entire forward section vanished in an explosion that lit up the battlefield like a newborn star. The massive ship broke in half, each piece tumbling away in different directions. The remaining Vorthi fleet broke. Ships turned and burned their engines at maximum, fleeing from the crippled vessel that had destroyed half their force. Some transmitted surrender signals. Others just ran. Within minutes, the space around the celestial dawn was empty, except for wreckage and bodies. Deho sat in his control room, surrounded by sparking consoles and failing systems. The ship was truly dying now. The last of the auxiliary generators was giving out. Life support was gone. The temperature was already dropping. He had minutes left, maybe, but he had done it. He had faced an entire fleet and won. One human against impossible odds. He activated his communicator one last time, broadcasting on all frequencies. His voice was weak now, exhausted and struggling for air in the thinning atmosphere. "This is Lieutenant Deho Kim. I'm still here, still human, still fighting. If anyone out there abandoned someone because you thought they were weak, because you thought they didn't matter, remember this day. Remember what one person can do when you push them too far." His vision was starting to blur. The cold was seeping into his bones. He thought about Earth, about his family, about the stars he had dreamed of reaching as a child. He had made it to the stars. He had burned brighter than any of them. Not a bad way to go. Then his sensors picked up new contacts jumping into the system. Multiple ships moving fast. For a moment he thought the Vorthi had returned with reinforcements. He tried to reach for the weapons controls, but his arms wouldn't respond. The new contacts resolved on his screen. They weren't Vorthi. They were Union ships. The fleet that had abandoned him had returned. Deho tried to laugh, but it came out as a cough. Of course they came back. Now that the fighting was done. Now that one abandoned human had done their job for them. The darkness closed in around him. His last thought was a simple one, tinged with bitter satisfaction. They would never forget this. Never forget what he had done. Never underestimate a human again. Admiral Kresh stood on the bridge of the Union flagship, staring at the view screen in silence. The rest of the bridge crew was equally quiet, watching the impossible scene before them. The space around the celestial dawn was a graveyard. Vorthi ships floated in pieces, some still burning, others torn apart so completely they were barely recognizable. Debris formed clouds that stretched for thousands of kilometers. "Sensor report," Kresh said finally. His voice was steady, but his hands gripped the command chair tightly. 14 Vorthi vessels destroyed or disabled, the sensor officer reported. She was a young Saurek, and her voice shook slightly, including the dreadnought Karvesh. Total enemy casualties estimated at over 3,000. The remaining Vorthi forces have retreated beyond our sensor range. And the Celestial Dawn? Critical damage to all systems. Life support offline, power at 2% and falling. Hull breaches across multiple decks. The ship is dead in space, Admiral. Survivors? A long pause. Unknown. We detected a broadcast from Lieutenant Kim approximately 8 minutes ago. No further communication since. Kresh closed his eyes. Lieutenant Deho Kim, the human they had left behind. The human that Commander Velnus had decided wasn't worth 10 minutes of time. That human had somehow turned a dying ship into a weapon and destroyed half a Vorthi fleet. "Get me a boarding team," Kresh ordered. "Medical personnel, damage control, full emergency equipment. I want the Celestial Dawn searched deck by deck. Find Lieutenant Kim." "Admiral," Velnus spoke from his station. The reptilian officer's voice was careful, controlled. "The ship may be structurally unsound. We could lose the boarding team." Kresh turned slowly to look at Velnus. The bridge fell silent again, but this time the silence had weight to it. "Everyone was watching, Commander Velnus," Kresh said quietly. "You left Lieutenant Kim behind on that ship. You decided he wasn't worth saving. He then proceeded to do more damage to the enemy than our entire fleet managed during the retreat. So now we're going to search that ship and we're going to find him, even if we have to take it apart piece by piece. Are we clear?" Velnus's scales flushed darker, but he nodded. "Yes, Admiral." The boarding team crossed to the Celestial Dawn in armored shuttles, approaching carefully through the debris field. They docked at one of the few intact airlocks and cycled through. The team leader, a human sergeant named Jiwon Park, was the first inside. The ship was dark and cold. Their suit lights cut through the blackness, revealing corridors that looked like they had been through a war. Blast marks on the walls, frozen atmosphere glittering in the beams of their lights. Bodies of Vorthi warriors, some intact, others not. Spread out, Jiwon ordered. Search every room, every corridor. Watch your step. This whole place could come apart. They moved through the ship carefully. Each new deck revealed more evidence of the battle that had taken place here. Sections that had been deliberately vented, corridors filled with frozen coolant and the crystallized remains of Vorthi soldiers. A cargo bay that was nothing but charred metal and melted equipment. One of the team members, a medic named Hyejin Choi, found something that made her stop. Team leader, you need to see this. Jiwon moved to her position. Hyejin was standing outside the armory, her light pointing at the walls of the corridor. The metal was scarred with claw marks, deep gouges where something had tried to break through. Blood was frozen in dark streaks. This is where he made his stand, Hyejin said softly. He was one man with a pistol against trained Vorthi warriors. Look at this. She pointed to a makeshift barricade built from equipment lockers. Behind it, plasma scoring marked where Kim had returned fire. The Vorthi blood trail led away down the corridor, showing where the wounded had retreated. They continued deeper into the ship. Every new discovery added to the story of what had happened here. A control room where jury-rigged systems still sparked with residual power. A maintenance bay where Kim had assembled his traps. Corridors that had been turned into death zones through creative use of the ship's own systems. He knew this ship better than anyone, one of the team members whispered. He used every system, every weakness, everything. It's brilliant. It's terrifying, another replied. One person did all this. They found him in a secondary control room deep in the ship's core. Daeho was slumped over a console, his suit covered in frost. The screens around him were dark, but data ports still glowed faintly, showing his last actions. He had been controlling the ship's weapons until the very end. Hyejin rushed forward, her medical scanner already active. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then her voice came through the team channel, tight with emotion. I've got a pulse. It's weak, but he's alive. Get a medical pod here now. The team moved with practiced efficiency. They carefully transferred Daeho to a stretcher, wrapped him in emergency thermal blankets, and rushed him back to the shuttle. Hyejin worked on him during the entire trip back to the flagship, fighting to stabilize his vital signs. Admiral Kresh was waiting in the medical bay when they arrived. He watched through the window as doctors and nurses swarmed around Daeho, working to save his life. The human was in bad shape. Hypothermia, radiation exposure, dehydration, multiple contusions, and half a dozen other problems. But he was alive. 2 hours later, the chief medical officer emerged from the treatment room. She looked exhausted but satisfied. He'll live, she said. Full recovery will take time, but he'll make it. The human constitution is remarkable. He should have died a dozen times over during that battle. Kresh nodded slowly. When he wakes up, I want to speak with him personally. News of what happened spread through the fleet like wildfire. The recordings from Daeho's broadcasts were everywhere within hours. Everyone heard his words. Everyone saw the battle data showing what he had accomplished. The mood in the fleet shifted dramatically. The alien crew members who had worked alongside Daeho on the Celestial Dawn found themselves facing uncomfortable questions. The humans in the fleet, previously relegated to the lowest positions, suddenly found themselves treated with new respect and wariness. Commander Velnus was relieved of duty pending investigation. Several other officers who had been involved in the decision to abandon Daeho faced similar consequences. Captain Theros submitted his resignation before it could be demanded, but the real impact went far beyond one fleet. The Vorthi had retreated from Union space entirely, requesting an immediate ceasefire. Their official reason was strategic reassessment, but everyone knew the truth. They were afraid. One human had destroyed half their attacking fleet with a crippled ship. How many humans were there on Earth? Billions. The Vorthi wanted no part of a prolonged conflict with a species that dangerous. Daeho woke 3 days later in a private medical room. Admiral Kresh was sitting beside the bed, waiting patiently. Lieutenant Kim, Kresh said softly. How do you feel? Daeho's throat was dry, his voice rough. Like I was abandoned on a dying ship and had to fight an entire fleet by myself. Kresh winced. I heard the recordings. I saw what you did. What was done to you was inexcusable. Yes, it was. Deho met the Admiral's eyes steadily. They left me to die because I'm human. Because they decided my life didn't matter as much as theirs. I know, and they will face consequences for that decision. Kresh leaned forward. But I want you to know something. What you did out there changed everything. The Vorthi are retreating. The Union is rethinking everything about humans. You've proven that humanity deserves a place among the stars. Deho was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice hard. I didn't do it to prove anything to you. I did it because I refused to die like some animal they left behind. I did it because I was angry. Because they threw my life away like it meant nothing. I understand, Kresh said. And you have every right to be angry. But your actions have consequences beyond your personal survival. Humanity is being offered full membership in the Union Council, equal status with all other species, command positions in the fleet, everything that was denied before. Because they're afraid of us now. Yes, Kresh admitted. They are. And sometimes fear is the only thing that brings respect. Deho closed his eyes. He thought about the hours he had spent on that dying ship, certain he would never see home again. He thought about the Vorthi he had killed, about the fury that had driven him to turn a wreck into a weapon. He thought about his family back on Earth, who must have heard by now what happened. I want to go home, he said finally. Back to Earth, I'm done with the fleet. That's your right, Kresh said. But before you go, I want you to know that you've become a symbol. Humans across the Union are calling you a hero. They're inspired by what you did. The story of the human who burned a fleet is spreading to every world. I'm not a hero, Deho said. I'm just someone who refused to die quietly. Sometimes that's all a hero is. 6 months later, Deho stood on Earth looking up at the stars. He had been given medals he didn't want, honors he didn't feel he deserved, and attention he definitely didn't ask for. But he had also come home. He had survived. The newsfeed still talked about him constantly. The battle near Helios Nebula had become legend. New recruits to the Union fleet heard about it in training. Human enlistment had increased by 400%. The Union Council had created new protocols ensuring that no crew member could be abandoned based on species. But Deho tried not to think about any of that. He focused on being home, on seeing his family again, on walking on the world where he was born. Sometimes late at night he still dreamed about the celestial dawn, about the cold and the darkness and the moments when he thought he would die alone. But he had survived. He had fought back. He had shown the galaxy that humans were not weak, not expendable, not lesser than anyone else. His younger sister found him one evening, standing in the backyard and staring at the sky. You're thinking about space, she said. It wasn't a question. Yeah, Deho admitted. I spent so long dreaming about the stars. Then I went up there and almost died. But I can't stop looking up. Will you go back? I don't know. Maybe someday. But if I do, it will be on my terms. No one gets to decide my worth again. No one gets to leave me behind. His sister hugged him. They stood together in the darkness, looking at the distant lights that represented worlds and possibilities. Somewhere up there, the galaxy was learning a lesson it should have known already. Never underestimate a human. Never assume they're weak because they're different. And never ever leave one behind. Because sometimes, just sometimes, that one person might burn your whole world down.